Well, thanks, James. And as much as I like to think I study and learn, the space is moving so quickly that I think it's hard to consider anybody a guru these days. There's a lot going on, but I'm excited about today's topic in particular around MCP observability. This is one of sort of like the three layers of the cake, if you will, around needs that teams have for MCP. And it starts on the baseline with enablement, goes up to observability, and then wraps with security. And today's focus will be that observability layer. And so I'm going to give a little bit of a baseline of what MCP is, talk a little bit more about gateways and technology that'll help you gain that observability, and then discuss a little bit more around what you could do with observability and how to think about it with some live demos. So let me get started. This will be a nice focused webinar. I will say that for those of you joining now live or as well possibly online later on YouTube when we upload this, if you book a demo using this QR code and mention that you're coming in from the webinar, you'll get 1 week of free access after the call. So it's a great way to come into the product, explore it directly for yourself. I will say that many teams have come in and explored our product and are telling us how it compares to what else is out there. I think it's a great experience if you get an opportunity to come in and see it because I think we're pretty far ahead of the curve on some of the things we're doing, especially around ease of use. So check it out. Um, this is my analogy for MCP today. This is the right flyer or a little illustration of it. But MCP today is a technology that really is a breakthrough in the same way that the first, airplane was a breakthrough. And this is going to transform our world. I think the amount of support behind MCP as a protocol sort of makes that very clear that this will be with us for many years to come. It also provides tremendous advantages that we haven't really had before. If you think about the alternatives of direct function calling in some of the LLMs that existed, you had to do a lot of manual labor to connect all of those functions to external APIs. And now with MCP, it's as easy as your vendors effectively doing the integration work for you for the most part. Aside from those who are building first-party MCP servers, which we're seeing far more of lately. And in those cases, it's also really useful because you just build an MCP server for your new service, and you could use that with any MCP compatible client. However, just like the first airplane, there are some risks involved. You have to be skilled at using it. And that's something that comes from, I think, A, participating in sessions like this and learning more, and B, using the right tools. The other thing I will say about MCP that is developing, which is really fascinating to me, is, just like this early prototype, today's MCP has a lot of limitations and things that are still to be defined or improved. And just like the concept of the airplane continued to improve over many, many years of trial and error, MCP is following that exact same standard path. And so, for example, one of the most interesting conversations today is around context preservation within the model context protocol, cost savings, reducing the overhead of LLM calls, because as I'll show in a moment, the MCP context gets injected into the context of the LLM every time it runs. And so over provisioning is a concern that we have. Now, what's fascinating is that doesn't mean we're abandoning MCP. Far from it. We're finding as a way or as a community ways to use MCP more efficiently. And actually, a gateway like the one I'm going to show you today is one of those ways that you can actually gain that efficiency by downscoping your MCP servers to only include the tools needed for the jobs that you have to do. Just like a plumber doesn't show up to your house carrying a waste belt with every possible tool that they have. They bring the tools that they need for the job. MCP behaves much the same way with the gateway like ours. So let's dive in a little bit more about this broad concept of MCP and the fact, I think really notably, that the protocol only says how the communication is supposed to work, but it's still up to you and your team to make it work. And frankly, as I'll describe in a moment, it's also up to you bringing the right technology stack to MCP deployment. While you can deploy MCP raw without any additional technology to support it, that is highly inadvisable, has a lot of limitations, and one of those, very germane to today's conversation, is a complete lack of observability. So this is that stack, that cake that I described earlier of needs. And it's interesting because we started on the inverse side, originally around security, and quickly realized that the number one thing that we need to solve for teams today is helping them with enablement, making MCP easier to use, making it something that can be deployed to a wide group of people who might not be technically inclined or experts, but still need to get the advantages of MCP. And even just some of the hard architectural problems of managing the types of servers that you have to run in your own cloud or run on your own machine, and how do you secure and observe that? Well, we've got some solutions to that. But in terms of observability, that's the second step. Once you've got it working, now you want to see how it's working. You want to make sure that it's working properly. You want to make sure it's working securely, and you want to have that understanding of if something does go wrong, where will you go? Where will you go in order to see what happened, diagnose it, and resolve it, or understand the impact of whatever happened. And then adding on top of the stack is the security. That's the lock it down. Now, we talked to a lot of companies where that's where they've started today is they've effectively actually turned MCP off entirely. They've locked it down. And that is something that a lot of teams are doing just out of an abundance of caution. However, with a product like ours, an MCP gateway, you'll be able to effectively say yes with an asterisk, and then, of course, get all that observability throughout it. Without any type of intermediary layer, MCP today is like this wild web of connectivity, which is wonderful because it's showing the power of this, universally interoperable standard, much like a USB-C. In fact, it's funny. This menagerie of wires looks much like behind my desk sometimes before I've cleaned up all the connectivity, but it's kind of that same sort of like rat's nest difficulty when it comes to diagnosing issues. I don't know if you've ever had issues with like a peripheral, like a mouse not working. You needed to figure out which one it was and had to, pull it through and unplug it and replug it. Well, MCP kind of suffers from the same problem unless you run it through effectively a hub or a gateway in between. And let's talk a little bit more about the context stack in particular. So this little diagram on the left shows almost to scale to some extent what the context stack of a typical LLM call usually looks like. It'll include a substantial system message, which usually comes from the baseline that you've set up. But then the tooling and augmentation comes in the middle here, and this actually includes the raw metadata coming from the server. And there's a lot going on here, but the metadata itself carries risk because this is where malicious payloads can get injected into your LLM's context. It carries cost because these do count for tokens. MCP is not free. That is a really important reminder. All of the metadata that you bring in for all of your tools is continuously taking up tokens, slowing down responses, and costing you real money. And so you want to, like, that plumber example from earlier, you want to minimize the tools on your tool belt going into a job. Latency is the next thing, well, once again, this plumber analogy really works. This is my first time trying it. But, if you overladen yourself with tools, imagine walking into a job, it's just going to slow you down, whereas having just the right ones for the job will help. The same thing is true for MCP. And then next is accuracy. Having irrelevant metadata actually causes a little bit of accuracy drift for LLMs. There have been some studies that have shown that if you feed the LLM unnecessary context unrelated to the job it has at hand, you'll actually reduce its accuracy by a little bit. So all of that goes into this tooling and augmentation area in the context stack. And then finally comes the user prompt. That's what you've actually asked the LLM to do, whether it be its instruction for an agent or the chat in your chat interface. And usually those are substantially smaller than the tooling and augmentation section, especially for a highly provisioned MCP environment. And what that ends up meaning is that this tooling and augmentation area is something that you really need to optimize. Once again, MCP is not free. It is something that has a tremendous amount of value, but you want to be mindful of using what you need. So we're going to talk a little bit more today about how you mitigate this risk, reduce your cost, shorten that latency, and improve the accuracy. And observability is a key to understanding this so that you can tune it. So let's go into that. To be enterprise ready, MCP does require a platform. This is the argument I'll make, and the analogies I'll make here are that, with other protocols that have come into the industry, some that we use every day, like SMTP and IMAP, the underlying protocols of email, we don't just use those protocols, we use products that use those protocols. And you use management products, enterprise management products on top of that to secure it and provide all of the auditability you need. Examples being Microsoft 365 or Proofpoint. SAML and OAuth are similar. They're protocols, but you need products to effectively make them work. Products like Okta or Microsoft Entra ID. With Git, it's also a protocol, but GitHub, GitLab, and Bitbucket have become the most popular sort of implementations of that. APIs have the same story. With APIs, you could certainly use them raw without any type of intermediary layer, but we use products like Kong and MuleSoft in order to smooth that over and provide some of those bells and whistles that you need if you're really deploying this rather than just testing it. And MCP is the same thing, and we position ourselves effectively as that solution that you'll need to use in order to really productionalize MCP. So here's the architecture diagram contrasting with that web from before, where everything flows through the gateway. And so that provides tremendous amount of advantages, as we will cover in a moment, but observability is a key one. Since you have one central point, sort of port of traffic, if you will, through which all of the information going in your MCP and leaving your MCP system, in both directions flows, you can now observe that. You can also apply things like rules to sort of block or redact certain information. That'll probably be another webinar coming up soon. But for today's purposes, having one central point through which all your information flows allows you to get that central visibility that enterprises absolutely need so that they can understand what's going on. So, zooming out a little bit, observability is just one of a handful of things that I consider to be table stakes for using MCP today. Enablement, as I described earlier, is critical. You want to have those buckets of tools to give to individual people on your team, things that you've reviewed, approved, are metadata locked, as I'll describe later, to ensure that you're not going to suffer from a potential rug pull or some tool poisoning. Identity management is also really important. MCP explains how identity can work as a protocol, but it doesn't give you the solution to that. And an MCP manager or gateway really should do that for you. Composition is the next one. That's effectively being able to take multiple MCP servers, combine them by cherry picking tools and capabilities off of them, and expose them as one virtual server, which is dramatically easier than having them individually connected. Feature filtering is really important. Once again, back to the plumber analogy of just bringing what tools you need. Observability is the focus of today's webinar, and then token management is the last one, and that's related to tokens for your what I call headless agents or AI agents that are running, but not typically through a user interface, but just running behind the scenes. Often you'll need to create tokens for them. So let's chat very quickly about what you should look for when evaluating an MCP gateway. The first thing I will say that's really important to any type of MCP deployment is having a server registry. This is the place where all of your team can submit MCP servers that they would like to use. And depending on your organizational settings in that system, ideally it also becomes effectively the process management platform where you can review and then approve them to be used. And so today, this is a very unofficial process at most organizations where either the entire company has said, no, you can't use MCP, or through some sort of bootleg mechanism, they've defined a way to indicate which MCP servers the team is allowed to use. But a really good gateway should, at least as a baseline, provide for your team that list of the MCP servers that are safe and approved for them to use. Next, the MCP client allow list. Once you bring in the MCP servers, then you connect them to the clients that use them. And some teams care quite a lot about where that data is being connected to. And a good MCP gateway should help you effectively manage that list of places where things can connect. And we have capabilities built into our gateway specifically to that end, where you could effectively toggle on or off different clients. So let's say your organization had an enterprise agreement with Anthropic and Claude, but not with OpenAI, and you wanted to allow Claude but block OpenAI. Well, the client allow list would effectively allow you to enforce that, so that your team would not be able to use your gateways places that you didn't want them to be used. That's really helpful. once again, from automatic sort of expression of your team's policies because it simply blocks them and tells the users why. And it's a great way for you to effectively define that policy programmatically. The third thing that you're going to want to look for is this concept of server composition around gateways and virtual servers, much to the point that I described earlier around reducing the context that you're sharing. Composition is a core part of helping that. So that's also kind of goes in with this concept of tool filtering, but you select from each of your different tool chests the tools that you need to provision to the engineering team, to the QA team, to the marketing team, to the sales team, to your customer success agent, to your refund processing agent, whatever you're building internally, you want to think about what tools they need and just provision that. And it's really easy to just give one gateway that has all the tools they need. And it also makes it easier from a lifecycle management perspective to be able to add or remove tools as the needs of that user group or agents change. And in addition, it provides this really nice logical organization of all the logs further to today's topic around observability. Next, a great MCP gateway will make it easy for your team to connect. And so what that means is there's multiple ways you can connect MCPs today. The easiest one is the remote streamable HTTP style, and that's effectively just you get a URL and you effectively copy and paste it into the MCP client. And usually, if it supports the concept of OAuth and dynamic client registration, it'll handle the rest and make the connection really straightforward. And even if it's less straightforward than that and it only supports authorization tokens, a good gateway will help you generate and manage those tokens, as I described earlier in the sort of table stakes here around token management. And lastly, on the baseline capabilities, good observability. So you're going to want to log both body level, header level, and attribution for those logs to specific servers, people, and gateways. Effectively, every message that flows through, if I go back to this diagram, every message that flows through here in our system gets logged, and it also gets effectively stamped with information to indicate all of the metadata, I might describe it, around that message. So, for example, which user, which MCP server, which MCP client, which MCP gateway, which connection, which is a specific established connection between those because you could have multiple connections running at the same time. All of that information now goes into the logs and allows you to perform some really important analysis, which is the purpose of today's webinar as we get a little bit deeper. The next page of capabilities here, these are what I would describe as slightly more advanced capabilities, but still really important to consider because they'll make your day-to-day easier and save you a ton of money and headache in the long run. First of all, MCP as a protocol provides far more capabilities than just tool calls, even though the vast majority of use today is tool calls. It also features things like resources and prompts from the server side and things like elicitation and sampling from the client side. But those capabilities might not be important to your agent. And in fact, provisioning those capabilities might be unnecessary and expose you to a little bit more of a security risk. And so, as a result of that, having the ability to turn off capabilities and really only allow through that gateway those capabilities needed for the job really, really important. It's just like when you hire team members, you don't give them access to systems that they generally don't need to do their work, A, to save money, but B, because that's just unnecessary risk. And the same thing is true for MCP with your agents, where you'll only want to give them the capabilities they need. A good gateway will support this headless agent flow, as I described, where you can effectively establish the list of agents and give them specific access to servers and identify which credentials they're going to use to access those servers and manage all that through a really simple environment variable that we call a token that you effectively just put in whatever agent building software you're using, and that allows it to come in. And when it comes in with that token, we're able to identify who it is and what they have access to, and that makes more advanced styles of agent building possible. The third one is probably my favorite on this entire list. It's something that I believe we're the only team in the industry doing today, and we call it metadata locking. That's when the metadata comes in from the MCP server, it's not necessarily the same for everybody. And this is a major difference versus APIs. Traditionally, with APIs, You have a list of endpoints, and everybody connecting gets that same list of endpoints. And you might have different permissions to whether you can call those endpoints or whether you'd be prohibited from doing so. But at the end of the day, that list is static and you could review it and you know in advance what you're getting. MCP is different. It's dynamic. Every time you connect a client and a server, and by the way, those connections are constantly happening and sort of either remaining established or reconnecting over the course of multiple days, you could end up getting a different set of metadata than what you got on the first day in the first connection. Now, this is where some of the risk and the concept of a rug pull comes in, because what might have been a perfectly benign context of metadata coming in, sort of the list of tools and their descriptions, may a day or more later, or after multiple people have connected to the server, start exposing something more malicious. And while there are products out there on the market today, especially some open source things that will allow you to toggle which tools are included, as far as I understand, nobody out there is doing this concept of metadata locking, where you, as a administrator, can read the metadata, confirm it's all exactly as you expect, it's benign, it's safe, lock it, and if ever during a connection the gateway detects that that metadata has changed, it'll give you some options, the default today being to effectively ignore that change so that it's not coming into your context, and that dramatically reduces your surface area for tool poisoning and rug pulls, which is really, really important. And so that's metadata locking. The bring your own identity concept is also something that's relatively unique to us, and that a lot of products out there have a specific gateway assigned to a specific identity or set of credentials. The way we designed it is to be a little bit more portable, so each gateway is just a URL that could be easily distributed to your team via obviously the product, but you could Slack it around or email it and say, here's your gateway. And then when that user shows up, they will be asked to establish their credentials with the MCP servers that they're using. So let's say they're using the Notion server or the SharePoint server. When they come in and connect to that, the gateway is going to actually go get their identities for each of those platforms, store it in a secure credential locker, and then use those same credentials when they're connecting through the gateway. Which means that when that user is accessing those MCP servers, they're only going to have the access that they have to that platform. So this is really important. So if you're running a search through an MCP server for, let's say, SharePoint, you're only going to see those things to which you should have access when you're using the MCP server too. That's really, really critical. And then lastly on this list, there's support for workstation MCPs. Workstation MCPs are the ones that you might think of as local MCPs. They're the ones that run on your computer directly, and they are really hard to manage and certainly to get observability on. Because often that server is directly talking to a client also on that computer. And so there's no trip through the network, and the sort of communications are constrained inside of a machine. And as a result of that, you really have no great opportunity for observability on it. Your network firewalls might not catch it if you were attempting to do so to block it or filter it in some way. And so we've developed some special technology around this that runs those workstation MCPs inside of a container, uses a special thing called a tunnel that is able to get that traffic actually up through your gateway and then back to whatever client, whether on their device or in the cloud. That they're using. And so workstation MCP support is something to look for very carefully, because if you don't have that, you're going to have gaps in observability, gaps in security, and gaps in governance. Lastly, for those of you who are working at larger firms, enterprise requirements are important to consider. You're going to be looking for things like SSO support, enterprise grade logging handling, which further to today's topic means taking those logs that are collected by the MCP gateway and being able to send them downstream to a collector. And we're compatible with something called Open Telemetry, which is effectively a industry general universal standard that allows logs to from one system to go into another and be relatively easily interpreted and understood. And so that's something that we offer on higher tier plans. Configurable RBAC, role-based access control, is another thing that's really important, making sure that people have the right access to modify or create gateways. For example, you might not want your users to make their own gateways. You might just want to create the gateways and then distribute them. Or you might want to have a sort of more democratized way in which your team uses MCPs while still getting all of that observability. That's something that this capability will allow you to have. Configurable rules are particularly exciting, and I think this is at the cutting edge of MCP gateways today. Today, we support things like regex-based filtering as well as custom classifiers. We've been working with some customers to use Microsoft Presidio's open source classifier, but we support other custom classifiers like Amazon Bedrock or AWS Bedrock. That's really advanced and allows you to look at those messages going through your gateway and either mutate them or decide whether to block them if it has content that you don't want flowing between those endpoints. And so rules are going to be really important to MCP in the future. Lastly, you're going to want to look for real-time alerts. That's the ability to get notified when you need to take action. And that's a really important part of observability. Broadly speaking, our product has alerts built into it today. So all told, across these 3 pages, these are the list of capabilities I would be looking for today as the state of the art when it comes to deploying an MCP gateway. And you can see how observability is a core part of effectively all of these today. And so that's why what we're talking about is so important. All right, let's chat about why you should care about MCP observability. Well, there's a handful of things that observability will give you that we've seen customers really adapting to. So, number one, you generally just want to know, are my MCP servers and clients working and communicating together? And that's where this observability angle comes in, where you can effectively see that the messages are going, that you're getting the proper status codes back. And that's important, especially if you're starting to build business systems and processes that rely on MCP, much like you would rely on APIs. Downtime with your MCPs can be very costly. And so understanding that those systems are working and being alerted when they're not is really, really important. And so that's where observability can help. Next is understanding what's being used. This is also really important from a different angle, and that's being able to figure out where to tune your MCP deployment. So, for example, if you find that there are MCP servers you're making available that teams just aren't using or aren't using enough to justify, you might want to eliminate or reduce the footprint of those MCP servers because that'll give you a little bit more security. Once again, every MCP server is both, it's like a door in your house. It's flexibility to come and go, but it's just another ingress point for a potential vulnerability. And so it's important to effectively tune that. But on the flip side, if you're seeing that an MCP server is being used heavily, that might be one where you might want to put additional scrutiny to make sure that it's meeting your security needs, it is working properly, or even just to make sure that it's not being overutilized. That gives you a fair bit of important information there. Next, as is a best practice, broadly speaking, for MCP, you're going to want to do monitoring for anomalies. And while our systems will help you detect and flag some of those anomalies, it's also important for you to be able to go down to the bare metal of sorts and look at those logs and understand what data is tracking through. This is really helpful during initial development and deployment of new agents and new MCP servers, but also just on an ongoing basis, best practices by a lot of organizations out there, I believe even the NIST standards, recommend making sure that you're periodically reviewing your logs. And so you're going to need an observability solution to be able to allow that. Now, if the worst thing happens and you do have some form of an incident, either a rogue agent that did something by accident or an agent that was co-opted to do something malicious or a bad internal actor who was trying to exfiltrate data, you're going to want to be able to understand what happened, piece together the mystery, and solve it so that you can assess the impact and take remedial actions. And that's also where observability comes into play. So you can look at effectively the crime scene and understand what data went where at what time using which credentials and really be able to understand it. And so observability is the only real way to do that. And because of the lack of observability directly built into the standard, you do need to buy a solution or find a solution that'll help you do that, especially one that'll be able to give you that full picture across all the different deployment types of remote MCPs, MCPs that are deployed into your private cloud but made available to your team, or the MCPs that run on people's machines. You really don't want to have any blind spots. So that's why it's really important when you're thinking about observability to ensure that all of those styles of deployment are supported by whatever observability solution you're using today. So let's talk a little bit more about what you can observe. You can use the data to understand what are the most popular MCP servers. You can use the data to understand what are the most popular features on those MCP servers. You can understand which members of your organization are making good use of MCP versus which are not, which might be helpful, especially if you have some internal goals around adoption or usage of AI. MCP is going to give you a really good snapshot of who's using it and who might be struggling and need a little bit more support. The next thing, and this is I think a really budding area that I haven't seen anything written about yet, but we always like to talk about it. It's this concept of response times, performance, application performance monitoring, as it is related to the Model Context Protocol today. And our product has some built-in capabilities to give you that picture into the different latencies of the various tools so that you can understand where your bottlenecks are and possibly resolve them. So, for example, if you've built an agent that's taking a really long time to respond to live customer support chats, and it is something you could boil down to a specific MCP tool call, you might be able to figure out why it's taking so long and resolve that to improve your overall response time and customer experience. You may also be deploying first-party MCP servers, meaning you build the MCP server to expose your internal technology and tools to your agents, and you want to understand whether those servers are running properly. This is a great tool for teams that are building their own MCP servers internally and want to understand them. So with that, I wanted to go to a live demo and show you some different capabilities of how MCP observability kind of works today. And so today is the day of the giant Cloudflare outage, which I believe is resolved, but I've gone ahead and run some things in advance to make sure we're going to have a seamless experience. And so in particular, I went to Claude that has an MCP gateway set up, and I asked it to effectively tell me what a specific team member was working on. And you'll be able to see from inside Claude directly the data that it was able to pull here. And so once again, this is the type of data that your MCP gateway is going to give you, but you'll only see the request and the response here. You will not see any other information about the latency, which connection or which user was actually making the call. So I did want to point out this distinction when I flip over to the MCP gateway and we look at those logs, you're going to see a lot more information than what you're seeing here. And of course, this is ephemeral, and you won't be able to sort of aggregate this. So I was able to go get some information for me here about what this team member was working on, and just sharing this so that when we go into the logs, you can kind of understand what we're showing. So first of all, let's head over to the reporting tab inside of MCP Manager. This is going to provide you an at-a-glance view of what's going on across your entire MCP ecosystem that's running through the gateway. Once again, I want to point out the importance of using a gateway that'll collect data from every single MCP server and client you're using and have no blind spots, because blind spots are really, really concerning and dangerous. And so once you have everything connected, all that data starts flowing here into your command center. Now, of course, you could send this downstream through OpenTelemetry log collectors to another source for aggregating and building charts. But we've built in a handful of really handy charts that our customers appreciate being able to access without having to write any queries. So for example, let's start with feature popularity by call count. Well, what you're seeing far and away here leading the pack is this one that we've established some automated testing on that runs every few minutes. And so that one is getting absolutely hammered just to make sure that certain systems are running. But you could see that very clearly on this graph that that one is working, here and how often it's run. But as we go downstream a little bit, you'll see some of these other tools that are being used, and it gives you a good understanding both of which MCP server is being used. So in this case, it was Waystation. And then in this case, it was Linear for a handful of these and Notion. And so you get a sense of what are the features that are being used, which might be helpful, especially if you're relatively aware of how MCP is being used in your organization, and this doesn't map to what you expected. So for example, if you saw this giant spike and you had no idea why this feature was being called so much, and you didn't understand what I did about why this is, being used by some automated testing or what the story was, that would be something that might trigger you to go take action and figure out why is this MCP feature being called so frequently. Next, you could break that down not only by capability or tool call, but also by server, so that if you're seeing specific usage patterns, you could understand it. Also by user, back to what I was describing earlier around internal mandates around adoption, you'll be able to see who's adopting AI and MCP more effectively than others, or what their usage generally is. And this does have some implications on cost as well, which we'll get to in a moment when I get to tokens. And oh, actually, it's right here. It's the next graph, token count per user. And so we do some estimation for you based on the amount of data being transferred and our estimation on what the cost is in terms of tokens, so that you can get a sense of how much are you spending on your AI bill based on data flowing through your MCP servers. And this is an important part, going back to that graph or the stack I had earlier with that tools and augmentation area. That's where that cost comes into play. And using a gateway, provisioning that down will give you some substantial cost savings, sometimes as much as 10x. Next, this is more from now we're into sort of the application performance monitoring section of this particular set of charts. So we're seeing the number of feature calls over time. So once again, you can kind of see this live running heartbeat of automated testing that's running on this particular work space and account. And you can see that things are quite healthy here. And this was some usage spike on 10/31. And you can see otherwise things are consistent, 24 calls per day. In other words, twice per hour this thing's running. Once again, gives me a pretty good sense that this stuff is working, which is great. You can also see the token count over time to get a sense of, when were large packages of information sent or received from your MCP servers. You could think about this if you're familiar with AWS or infrastructure, sort of like network in, network out is a common metric to understand what's going on with your servers. Well, this is token count, is the way that we think about that. As we get down into this section here, we've got the duration of the feature calls. This is the 95th percentile. This is the median. And you can see this linear listing issues one is by far the one that takes the most time in both the 95th and the 50th percentile. And so in this case, wow, this is chunky. It looks like the linear tools list issue one is something over 12 seconds and on the 95th percentile. And the median, effectively the 50th percentile, is over 10 seconds to respond. So that's interesting. Now, I don't know whether there's anything I could do with linear to optimize that, but it does mean that if I'm building workflows, I should understand that that particular feature is going to take some time to run. And it may be worth, if it's a bottleneck, communicating with the team at Linear about why this is taking so long. They might not be aware of it, or it might be doing some additional work, especially around pagination. And so that gives you quite a bit of information. Um, Moving on, you can see the server popularity by user count, which will tell you how many individual users in your org have adopted that server within a certain period of time. You can see the error codes by MCP server. So if you have certain MCP servers with lots of failures, you'll be able to figure them out. And then you'll be able to see the response codes. Now, typically, you're going to be looking for 200s and 202s within the MCP spec. But if there are any 400s or 500s, that's where we'll be able to show you what those issues are, and you can sort of start diagnosing them. So this rolling back up is the sort of basic reports tab. We also have a usage tab. Now this is based on how we're billing for the MCP gateway. And so we count things like the number of messages that are going through the gateway per month, which you can see on a monthly basis here, on a daily basis here, as well as the number of active connections per month, which you can see tallied here. So I've got a couple other tabs open we can go to. So this is the gateway that we were using, and this is actually a very specific filtered view of the data that I was working with. So for example, in the Claude calls that you could see here, I was only working with the linear server. I was only working with these tools, and you could see the different tool counts that it ran. In fact, this list users call, as I was preparing for the demo, I was connected to the wrong instance of Linear, and so it wasn't working, and so it made a couple extra calls. I could see that. Then when I connected it to the right instance of Linear, it found what I was looking for. You can see I'm the user that used it, and you can see this usage popping up today. And so that's live real-time flowing data to give you a sense of what's going on. You also have the ability to go to the logging table specific for that gateway and see everything that's going on there. Or you have the ability to go to the general universal log platform and see all of the logs running across your entire system. And that's where I'm going to spend some of my time now. I did want to pop over here to just show you what it looks like when you open up one of those logs. You'll see quite a bit of detail on it, including what type it was. This was a proxy response success for the tools list call. You can see the date time, you can see the approximate size and tokens, how long it took, the response code. Once again, some of this information is great for developers building MCPs or building agents, but you can even get into the body and see exactly what was returned. And this goes into that metadata management. Now, we have other parts of the gateway that'll help you effectively control what's going on here, but you can see down to sort of the raw protocol itself. In fact, under the hood, MCP is just this protocol called JSON RPC, Remote Procedure Command. Um, and that's flowing here. You can see the ID number and the results. And so this gives you that really, really sort of like bare metal view of what's going on. You can also see the headers that are going back and forth, some of the internals, which once again, more helpful if you're debugging or developing the systems. But if I X this out, let's go take a look at some of the headers that we have here, just to give you a sense of what information we collect. Now compare this with the request in the body that we had before. So we're going to see what type of call it was. We have a different set of those because we're a proxy. So you'll see MCP responses, you'll see MCP requests, you'll see proxy requests and responses, and that sort of tells you which side of the gateway it is and which direction the arrow is pointing. You'll see what type of method it was, whether it was a tool call, an initialization. You'll see the correlation ID, which is information that we put into the logs that you can track a specific session and command back and forth. The columns here go on and on, but I'll try to highlight a handful of ones that are, I think, particularly relevant. You'll see information imprinted about which gateway it was, which host it was, which server was being used, what the URL was of that server, which identity was being used, what that user's email was, what their name was, what feature they were using, on and on and on. Those information or those pieces of data are also represented as these static IDs that even if the labels change will allow you to make your queries really, really specific. And then finally, you'll see really, like I said, that raw information around the RPC version, what MCP protocol version it is, the amount of tokens that were used, the latency duration, and of course the date and time. And so, as I described earlier, if you're on an enterprise plan, you'll be able to send this downstream to an OpenTelemetry collector. But that's something that'll be really helpful for larger orgs. I've seen some teams use Grafana, for example, to create some really compelling graphs. Um, and so even as you get into deeper calls, you'll be able to see directly the data. So this is when we go to, what it saw when it made this response. We'll see this raw information inside here of exactly what was going through the wire, per se. Now, when it comes to things like rules and detecting entities inside here, this is how our gateway is able to deliver that capability by inspecting this raw information and looking for things that you've set rules on to either block or handle in a certain way. So, rolling back up, what does an MCP manager deliver? Well, enablement. It gives you those nice URLs that you can drop into your clients. It gives you the observability that we described and saw here, and it gives you security to lock things down. If you want to learn a little bit more about the security or the enablement side, we've got some other webinars that were more focused on that, but I want to be respectful of time on this one and sort of bring it to a close and with a quick conversation around ROI. So using an MCP gateway that'll grant you this observability, but all these other important things is going to reduce your risk. It's going to reduce your costs. It's going to improve the accuracy of your agents, and it's going to speed things up. And a number of those factors come from being able to lock the metadata, but also being able to get that observability is important on top of all of these different really calculable components of the ROI. And so I wanted to wrap up once again by inviting anybody who's watching this to contact us if you'd like a live demo. And after that demo, if you just mention that you were on the webinar, you'll be able to get 7 days of free access. We're also hosting an event live for those of you who are in New York City or willing to travel on December 4th. In the city in the evening. We're doing a reasonably intimate event with MCP builders and makers. The list is invite only, but you could apply to be considered. And there's a link in the chat, and there will also be a link in the description on YouTube. And we're trying to bring together, a really good conversation, a little bit of show and tell, perhaps, on what folks are working on, and have conversations about how team members or how people in the community are bringing MCP into production in their orgs. So that's a wrap on today's webinar on observability. I hope you enjoyed the quick view into what MCP is, if that's new, but also how observability is a core part of that. I'll pause now for any questions that we have.
Yes, if you've got any questions, drop them in the chat. I've got some, but I'll hold mine back. That was really fascinating, Mike, and I think it's crazy to see how much has been built in this area already, considering how young the protocol is.
Yeah.
Um, I'm interested. You started off with how expensive MCP is in terms of consuming. It's kind of a greedy consumer of context and tokens, LLM tokens rather than access tokens. Um, and then there's a few charts in there around token usage. Is that where you see that? Is this a kind of untapped or unseen need in terms of making your MCP stack efficient?
Yeah, we're going through this interesting phase or pendulum swing, if you will, where MCP came out and people thought more MCP was better MCP. It reminds me of when you got your first iPhone and you downloaded every possible app from the App Store because you thought each app would power you up, and then you realized that there were certain that you used and others that were kind of just cluttering up your phone, possibly taking up some storage space that you would rather use for other purposes. And so we as an industry right now are going through that pendulum swing where folks are realizing that nope, the ideal way to use MCP is not to connect everything and allow all that context to flow through. Instead, it's to be intentional about what you're connecting. Just because it's really easy to connect, which is great, doesn't mean that you should connect everything. So, yeah, you're spot on. This is a place the industry is sort of very quickly turning to both reduce LLM costs, which are top of mind for folks, but also decrease response times and improve accuracy. Also, really, really important considerations. And I'm seeing some really clever approaches to it. Anthropic came out with effectively like a way to have the LLMs generate code that calls the MCPs. It's still MCP under the hood, but they're coming up with sort of clever ways to manage the context. Um, but yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more in this area, and especially if you have a gateway and can limit that list of MCP tools and capabilities to what you need, you might not need some of those workarounds. I think that's just part of what we're doing that's a little ahead of the curve in terms of managing context and cost.
And I guess on that theme, are there any, not necessarily just reports, but particular aspects of observability that customers which have been using MCP Manager have been really demanding, or types of reports or things they've asked we maybe haven't seen today? Um,
Yeah, it's interesting that how important it is for teams to just understand who is using it and what they're using. Um, It's just a basic question, but it helps teams understand what's going on in their organization and their MCP stack.
and I guess finally, without giving away too many secrets, are there any areas of observability, whether it's additional reports or charts or other aspects of observability that you'd like to build into the gateway, or I
Mm.
suppose platform going forward?
Yeah, I think there's a big opportunity around automated alerts and detecting anomalies that we can do sort of autonomously. We are in the age of AI, and I think we could bring even more intelligence into our platform in a wide variety of ways. But reviewing logs and bringing certain things to the attention of administrators is one of those tasks that's really well suited to AI. And so that's going to be very exciting to see in a quite meta way how we're able to use AI, inside the platform for our customers to be able to allow them to focus on what matters.
That's very interesting. So maybe alerts going to LLMs and AI doing half the work that,
Yeah, automatic detection, perhaps even automatic remediation.
well, fascinating, a little bit scary, but definitely fascinating. Well, If nobody else has got any more questions, I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you very much, Mike. That was really fascinating. I'm sure if everybody's like me, they're blown away by what's been built so far and are very excited about what's coming next.
Yeah. Thanks, James. Thanks everybody for joining.